see coming to 2012. We've got these converging cycles. We know that with the precession of the equinox, this is in the geological record, we have that. We know that the sun flips every 11 years, which is going to occur 2012. And we know that there's this incoming object that's also approaching. The fact is, it is true. We do know that there's an object, it's called Nemesis, is the best term for it, this approaching dwarf star. I don't like to use the term Planet X because it's not a planet. So we need to call it what it is. It's a highly compressed dwarf star, and it has a thermal signature, and it has an X-ray signature, and it has a lot of debris around it, asteroids and other junk. The Chandra X-ray telescope reports this object coming in the inner solar system between Jupiter and the Sun. That's a fact. The same as the SOHO is showing strange sun activity with decrease and now going to be an increase. And they're telling us specifically in public reports that they expect this solar cycle to peak in the next 3 to 4 years, 2012 or thereafter, which is just the next year and a half, is going to be 50% more active than any previously recorded sun cycle. Back to Galileo, 24 cycles. The thing that I think is criminal is that the scientists and the politicians are not telling the public, because if you were to know, for example, with a certain percentage of probability that a solar activity would create a pole shift, which would cause a break-off of a major section of the Mauna Loa supervolcano in Hawaii that would cause a tsunami to strike California, traveling at Mach 1 at half a mile high, I think it would be criminal not to tell those people to get out of the way. Now, it's approaching what's called below the ecliptic, which means it's below the plateau of the planets which circulate like a disk around the sun. As it approaches the sun, its velocity will increase because it's going to be yanked in by the sun, and then it'll whip past it and then head back out into space in a hyperelliptical orbit. So its effects would be expected to pull a plasma discharge from the sun below the ecliptic or below the plane of the Earth as it approaches, and so it's more likely to affect the southern hemisphere. It also is likely to induce a tweak, if you want to call it like a ping, like an electromagnetic pulse weapon. The energy is released with the plasma of the Earth, which is absorbing all this plasma energy, and if it hits specific frequencies, there'll be a kind of we call a coup-contra-coup effect, where it'll hit one place and then it'll ping and hit the opposite side of the Earth. What it's going to do is this: it'll cause the sun to burst out sunspots and solar mass ejections, and that'll perturb the magnetosphere of the Earth, will cause the release of plasma to cause major superquakes and volcanoes, increase rainfall, and could break off the volcanic island there in the Azores off the African coast that could cause a tsunami 540 miles per hour heading toward North America at 800 to 900 feet high. In the Pacific, the depth of the water off of the Hawaiian Islands is miles down. Mauna Loa, the cone builds up, and it has a shelf where the magma builds up and flows over the side, and it forms like a big mushroom. Well, if that breaks off because of a major superquake, you got a giant slide of Mauna Loa, according to the San Jose Tsunami Center and the Research Center in Switzerland. They're two top centers in the world. They've predicted that it would create a super tsunami that would be Mach 1 or 740 miles per hour, traveling toward all of the Pacific coastal areas, Japan, North America, South America, at half a mile high. That's a real possibility. Now, we're not talking about Roland Emmerich's, where the whole Earth is swept by tsunamis across the Rocky Mountains and all that stuff. But we are talking about some very big tsunamis that might not occur early, but occur late. And if there's a major flip in the magnetic field, and there's a major global superquake where you get a massive release in quakes all over the Earth at the same time, the kill zone is 80% of the world population within 100 miles of a super tsunami hitting the coastal areas. The governments are not preparing the people for this at all. The globalists know that there is changes coming, and they're prepared to survive.
It's way underground, it's way secret, and it's big-time stuff.
Yeah, and they're getting ready step by step to set up the final stages of world government based on a carbon credit new green bubble, so they can steal the last tiny bits of crumbs of wealth. So only the global super elite are there, and then the killing fields will start. Then they'll release plagues, then they'll start wars or rumors of wars, then they'll cause or amplify earth changes, or if they're coming, they won't provide any protection for the public.
They're sheep-dipping the entire society to kind of buy into the lies of what's going on.
We've got an economic system which was in the fall of 2008 They literally are collapsing it and pulling the money and credit out of the real economy into a casino economy. And according to economic experts, they've contracted it by the world economy by 1/4 of the money on the planet. I'm predicting that we're going to have a move to try to set up a false flag like a nuclear explosion in one or more cities in the United States, because they want the distraction of us to have to go to war to pull us out of the so-called depression, which they created. And at the same time, they also want us to be distracted and have a biometric system set up so they have total control of the population, so that we won't interfere with their survival when they take their golden tickets and go underground. Don't tell the public, distract them with war, austerity, famine, and depression, so they won't interfere with us going underground to hide from what's coming, so we can reemerge decades or centuries later when the earth is fit to live in. Where the big aha comes is that we now know that the magnetic flip of the sun is about to happen in less than 2 years, and the magnetic flip of the earth has already started, which means it can tip it over. And we also have proof now of a cycle that's roughly every 36 to 3,800 years of an incoming dwarf star that's estimated between 5 and 20 Earth masses, that is now between the inner solar system, below the ecliptic, or the plane in which the planets rotate around the solar system, and coming in now between Jupiter and the asteroid belt. So the WISE satellite and NASA and the Jet Propulsion Lab here in California is monitoring it. They know this object is coming in. Dr. Harrington, who was a senior astronomer back in the 90s, discovered this, and he went down to Auckland, New Zealand. He went to Australia, and he actually found evidence that, in fact, it was already published back over 16, 18 years ago, that there was, in fact, quote, a dwarf star. I don't like to call it Planet X because it's not a planet. It's a dwarf star. It has an infrared signature, which you can pick up, and it has an X-ray signature, but it doesn't give off visible light. So you can't see it unless you use infrared, or even better still, X-ray. Infrared and X-ray are the only ways to see this. You can also see it if it perturbs or starts to move, as it's moving now between Jupiter and Mars, where there's a giant belt of asteroids that is likely to perturb or move them, or even to pull some of them with it, because it's got quite a mass. And it's coming in from the constellation Scorpio. Here's the issue. They know this, and when the big aha comes, it's like all these converging cycles tells us, and this is why all of these prophets, they talk about the Nostradamus effect. They had the series, but if they all looked at it just prophetically, what I'm telling you here can be verified scientifically. We've got evidence from the Chandra X-ray satellite. We've got evidence from IRAS, the infrared satellite system. We have evidence from the South Pole Telescope. It's a public domain. You can go online, but also I have sources that are classified. If we look out with satellites, if we look at the geological record, if we look at the magnetic record of the magnetite in the rocks and volcanoes, if we look at all these evidences of species die-off or the telluric fields in the oceans, because when these pole reversals happen, it kills on average 84% of the life in the oceans. Oceans are very conductive of electric currents, so if there's a lot of plasma discharges through the oceans, a lot of the ocean-based life forms are going to get fried, and it kills 14% of the life on land.
And they are certain that a X or M-class coronal mass ejection will strike the Earth, wiping out most of the power grid and regular communications and satellites. And they know that, and they're not going to harden the system or have any redundancy, both from conventional sources, which people can check out, and from my classified sources, both in the United States, Canada, and Australia. Those are 3 countries. The government, if there's a natural disaster of any kind, they're going to turn off the grid. And number 2, they're not going to protect the grid from a coronal mass ejection, which is, according to my reports, is a virtual certainty by 2013. We're going to have a massive surge of ultraviolet and high-energy X-ray and cosmic radiation. It's much more malevolent than the movie 2012. The real danger is the collapse of the magnetosphere, which is already happening, that people can verify themselves, because the cosmos, without the magnetosphere, is like being inside a microwave. When the magnetosphere collapses, it's going to allow high-energy ultraviolet light, X-rays, and cosmic rays to strike the Earth, killing a lot of life, including most of the grassy plants, a lot of the trees, and a lot of the upper benthic layer of the oceans. It'll come back, but it'll take a while.
You have a convergence of cycles. The poles of the sun flip every 11 years, which we call a sun cycle. Now the sun's starting to change its activity. It's starting to rev up in the end of solar cycle 24. It's been very quiet, down about 5% or less of its normal sunspot activity. The poles on the Earth, they flip every 11,500 years. It occurs with an increasing crescendo of earthquakes and volcanoes, which release sulfur dioxide, increase rainfall, and push us into an ice age. And that's in the geological record. You can actually find the record in volcanic rocks and rocks in the Canadian Shield and around the world, that these events happen in cycles, just like the Mayans talked about. So what we've got now is these events, which means crop failures. Long before you ever have, quote, an ice age, you're going to have fluctuating weather and rain when it shouldn't be, so crops will die, or drying, or drought when it shouldn't be, and then extreme rains in other times, which is what we're seeing. Earthquakes and volcanism happen in cycles that happen with the precession of the equinox. Now, it takes 26,000 years for us to rotate around the galaxy, but it actually, because of the rotation of the sun, effectively is reduced to 23,000 years, and we have this precession effect that happens at halfway through that, and every 11,500 years there is a reversal of the magnetic field of the poles of the Earth.
The geomagnetic reversal started in the late 90s. 2012 is just the midpoint of that process. We know that the coronal mass ejections are a virtual certainty, an 1859 type event.
And there's little cycles. This is one of the bigger cycles. There's an even bigger cycle of grand ice ages that happen roughly every 105,000 years. So you've got a polar cycle that's going to flip in 2012, a precession of the equinoxes, which we're actually starting into now and will kind of culminate on or after 2012. It's not on a precise date. And so we've got convergences of things that are happening at the same time. One's the mini ice age cycle. We're also converging in that one. That's according to Robert Felix and other experts. So the long cycle, the short cycle, it's a cycle of 11,500 years. The shorter cycle, which is the 350-year cycle for ice ages, we're also in time for the 105,000-year big ice age as well.
They're not going to confront the public directly. They just want to convince us, like a made-for-TV movie, we're going into martial law. The fact is, we've been in martial law since the 1930s.
These people are feverishly building underground bases at the rate here in America, for example, of 2 bases per year, anywhere from $18 to $26 billion. 5.24 to 7.25 cubic miles in size, most of them in dormant volcanic domes or built with nuclear explosions underground.
Because I work with Special Forces Delta, I know what their COG plans are, and this is the same with not only America, but Canada, Britain, and other countries. If there are major catastrophes of nuclear war, biological war with weapons release, Earth changes, or a coronal mass ejection or anything, it's for them to hide in their, quote, hotels underground with their military forces surrounding them and lots of supplies and lots of games to play underground. And then after 6 months to come up after the so-called remaining population, if they survive and haven't eaten each other, scavenged each other, or killed each other, to mop up. If we knew what was coming, and we hardened our satellites to things like a coronal mass ejection or a magnetic field flux, or the reduction and the protection of the geomagnetosphere for, say, 30 days, and we had facilities to protect the population, we'd be fine. But what the government's going to do is allow it to happen. But if you're not protected, you're going to get burned, and you're going to get radiation exposure during those days and weeks when it's dangerous.
We're talking weeks here, 3-4 weeks, maybe.
Yeah, probably between 2 to 4 weeks max.
Well, how deep do you need to be underground? 2 or 3 feet of dirt above you?
8 feet of dirt or 1.5 feet of concrete.
8 feet of dirt or 1.5 feet of concrete.
Yeah, that's all. You don't need to be in an underground city. In fact, these underground cities, if there's major earthquakes, are going to be most certainly going to be their entombed hotels underground. They're not going to be coming back.